Well, the blood generation has sort of evolved from sort of growing up in Bougainville. You've got your family around you and your extended family and your cousins, and then suddenly as a child you see that there's a lot of tension in society and water towers have been blown up and there's curfews, and suddenly people are leaving. We're the last sort of family to get on the last plane to come to Australia because of the Bougainville crisis or the conflict. The Papua New Guinea Defence Force had come in and created a blockade. And so you sort of grow up wondering about your cousins and sort of everyone left back home. And as a family coming to Australia, living with my mother's family, become a little bit estranged. And at a time when I was in high school and quite young, Dad was at a lot of protests and activism meetings and, you know, for self-determination for Bougainville and for intervention of human rights to come in. And in one of his peace talks, he'd gone to Solomon Islands and come back with a tape, a cassette tape. And it was the cassette tape and it was called The Blood Generation. He said, this is for you, this is what's happening back home. And so I immediately put on the tape and it was a young band singing about what it was like to grow up in conflict behind the blockade, you know. And I just thought, oh, that's sort of, they're my contemporaries, they're my friends. And I'd say, Dad, what is the blood generation? And he'd say, oh, that's what we're calling people like you who were born into war. We feel sorry for our children the first 9 years of their life from 1990 onwards. That's all they know is war. So it's something I just sort of grew up with, and it wasn't until fairly recently that I felt so strongly about this period of history that I wanted to make a body of work around it. The blood generation is made up of a lot of portraits of young people from all over Bougainville. So you've got Sami standing in front of the truck, which is the mining truck, earth-moving truck, and that's the main sort of narrative, is the triptych. So what you have in the gallery is Sami and the mining truck. And that's responding to how it became known to the world. It became known to the Australian government, to the mining company who was already in production and extracting gold. And it became known to them that it was the women of the land that were against mining, and that in Bougainville the land is passed through the female lineage, what is known as matrilineal land owning groups. So there's a story where the women would wake up very early before the mining staff would come and start their engines and dig into the earth. And they'd wake up at the crack of dawn and take their children and their babies and sort of chain themselves to the trucks so that they couldn't. Or if they would have to obviously mine the women and children as well as the land. So that's what that image is really about, is sort of saying Sami, who is a descendant of the land-owning women from that land, putting her there, is placing her in where her aunties and the women before her stood, which was fairly recent, less than 20 years ago. There's a lot of stories that went behind the process to the work. And Sami was born to a very well-known family, the Mirioris. So her father is a leader and her mother is also a human rights leader as well, works with women's groups. And their family is a lot like my family. And when we left to come to Australia, they had to flee to go to Honiara in the Solomon Islands. So it was this sort of relationship that we knew, there was another family like us over there. And then when the peace process came back, the Mirioris came back to Bougainville. And so when I wanted to do this work with my cousin, Stuart, I said, we have to go and talk to Sami. We have to involve her in this project. The land, for Bougainvillians, land is everything, we're dependent on the land. And Veronica, standing there in the garden, she's in a sweet potato garden, or we say cacao garden. And Veronica is very important because I think while it's our strength that the land is inherited through women and that we're dependent on our land and we're still very rich with that. With that comes sustenance, our food, but it also is something that I've found that's become quite a burden, personally, for women in our society. With that becomes so much responsibility. And Veronica, for me, and I hope for other people, you can see the strain on her that she has, and that she's surrounded by responsibility of feeding her family, tending to that garden. There's a lot of labour involved. It's all about relationships, and first of all with Stuart and I being related, but also having that trust and bringing him into Bougainville and inviting him into these locations, these spaces with friends and family. And a lot of the people you see in Blood Generation I'm related to, or I know them. The other thing that we set out to do is to sort of create a new visual language around something that sort of bothered me is the history of photography on Indigenous peoples. It's been a very negative one, So I saw Stuart's style and he has a very beautiful sensitivity around portraiture. And there's a beautiful photograph he took of my father underneath the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And so I just said to him, I can just see that we're going to create a very sort of defiant body of work, and that we're going to name, and people are going to know who they are. We're going to be very open about and transparent about the process. It has to be bold. It has to be, and the stories, they're loosely related to the sites. And so the mine and Russel, that's a very important, that point of view. There's been so much documentary about Bougainville crisis, in the media and photojournalism coming in, and to have Russel crouching and just looking over. Very often locals will come to that spot and just look, and in a sort of tragic but funny way would say, oh, that's the local tourist destination, So having that scale is very important because the severity of that mine, that pit, has disrupted our future, our determination, The idea that the modern government is tying in independence or referendum with mining, So having young people sort of trapped in that is really important. I think that youth in Bougainville society right now are the most overlooked and sort of left out and sort of hardened, and it's a hard life for a young person in Bougainville, with Matthew and in the blue corner and Chris, they're fighting it out in the boxing ring, and there's Jack and Mark in the copra shed, you know, and Veronica in the garden, you know, sort of where do you find young people? Well, they're either working in labour or they're sort of trapped in these pressures that society has on them. You have to ask yourself, you know, what is the blood generation? You know, how did this come about? And for me, this is a story as much about Australia as it is about the obvious, what you see in front of you. We wouldn't be called the blood generation if it wasn't for external interest in mining and sort of the Australian government and the Papua New Guinea government, their involvement.